Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 213, April 7th to April 13th, 1865. Last week, we had the breaking of the siege of Petersburg, including the Battle of Five Forks, and the general assault by federal forces that will snap the Confederate defense. Lee's army is now on the run, Richmond being abandoned. Grant has broken the 10th-month siege and will now look for the final push. Before we get into that, though, let's talk about some Patreon content. And, of course, we had a episode that we posted here for the month of April that is very relevant to some of the things that we talked about. Fort Stedman, Five Forks, and now Sailor's Creek that we're about to talk about. We have a picture slideshow showing the modern-day battlefields of those three locations. We have other picture slideshows of other modern-day sites. And we also have memoir reviews and movie reviews. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. And those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. The cities of Petersburg and Richmond would both surrender to the oncoming Union troops on April 3rd. Godfrey Weitzel and his United States colored troops would march to the capital and receive the formal surrender in Richmond itself. Lincoln, who had arrived at City Point before the all-out assault, would enter the city, walking amongst the burned-out buildings on Dock Street. He would meet with Grant and Meade to discuss the further moves. It was decided correctly that Lee would be making for North Carolina, so all efforts to try to stop him were to be expended. Grant would move on a key juncture of the railroad, actually a shortened trip than what Lee was currently undergoing. The primary corps of the Army would be tasked with the pursuit, those being the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps, followed by the 9th along with Sheridan's cavalry. Ord's Army of the James would also be filling in. Sheridan's cavalry, in many ways, are going to be continuing their actions from Five Forks. Fitzhugh and Rooney Lee, along with Bushrod Johnson's division, were caught on the south side of the Appomattox and making their trek west. Custer's cavalry would catch them on the 3rd at a place called Namazine Church. Originally, they would be drawn up across Namazine Creek, the 1st Vermont dismounting, but being thrown back by a regiment in Wise's command due to a counterattack. Making for the church, Rufus Barringer and his North Carolina brigade would attempt to hold off the federal troopers, throwing a countercharge that would fail. Barringer would almost have the 5th North Carolina cut off, but would successfully get them on the road to safety, himself being captured in the process. Thomas Custer, the brother of George, would receive the Medal of Honor for this engagement, capturing a North Carolina battle flag. April 4th would see a major delay in Lee's movements. Reserve rations that were supposedly sent to Amelia Courthouse had not arrived, so he would need to pull up and wait for his wagons to arrive with much-needed supplies. It's actually part of the overall problem of the retreat itself, is that it might have actually been a successful retreat. It's a very close-run thing, and I think a lot of people don't realize that Grant and the Union forces that are in this area are very close to kind of running out of supplies themselves, and they're going to kind of give up the chase should Lee actually make it to, say, like Danville on the North Carolina border. They're going to be kind of like out of luck there. So there is this notion that had there been better planning, there's a miscommunication, bad logistics is always going to be plaguing the Confederacy, so it's not necessarily too surprising that this happens. But they're not going to be in a position where the supplies are going to be where they need to be, and that's ultimately the problem in this retreat. Additionally, he was going to be waiting on the converging columns, losing a march on Grant, who, if you remember, still has a shorter route. Sheridan and the 5th Corps were on the heels of the Army of Northern Virginia, arriving at nearby Jetersville, and might have been overwhelmed by Lee and the Confederates had they had any kind of organized effort. As it was, the march would continue, but Sheridan would find Lee's wagon train caching it at a place called Painville on the 5th. Hugh Janeway, commanding the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, would fall on the train, which crucially contained the rations. Here is also where we have the Confederate black companies serving, but to actually how much they did in the resisting of this cavalry assault, it's kind of questionable. Many were simply taken prisoner, the wagons being destroyed. We mentioned also when we talked about that, those two particular companies, a lot of them don't really have uniforms at all, right? So the Union troopers are going to kind of just assume that they are, teamsters, and that's kind of a common role that you would have in these Confederate armies for such individuals. So it was very likely to them that they probably were acting in that capacity. It's very questionable as to whether any of them had firearms or used firearms in this particular engagement. Most likely, probably a lot of them would have just surrendered, kind of the writings on the wall, Richmond's abandoned. So you're going to have different regiments as well who are going to have the same kind of attitude. Lee would parry the enemy troops back toward Jetersville, Grant arriving there and ordering a vigorous pursuit. Lee was turning toward trying to get to Lynchburg, where there would be supply and potential safety. A bridge over the Appomattox near Farmville became a target for the Union troops. The 54th Pennsylvania and 123rd Ohio from the Army of the James would be dispatched to deal with it. They would act defensively against rebel cavalry, making the Southerners believe they were supported by a much larger force. Eventually they were forced to surrender, but not before they had successfully cut off the Confederates, allowing for the rest of the army to catch them. April 6 would see the Federals get at Lee at a place called Sailor's Creek. Elements of the Federal cavalry would skirmish with the Confederates, capturing some ordnance in the process. Gordon and his 2nd Corps would skirmish with Humphreys and his Union 2nd Corps at a place called Lockett's Farm. Gordon would make a stand with artillery and would see an assault by Federals, which would rack up some prisoners and captured stores. To the south of this action will be another stand made by the Confederates. Richard Anderson would halt his men at a place called Marshall's Crossroads, just past Little Sailor Creek. As a result of Crook's cavalry harassment, Anderson felt he needed to face them and protect the wagons in the process. This would create a gap in the column as Longstreet would continue on the march. Merritt's cavalry would fill the gap, blocking the continuing journey. Ewell would form up his men as well, which included Custis Lee and the Naval Brigade with Kershaw into a defense, for a time having to endure the barrage of Union artillery. Wright's 6th Corps arrived and pressed down the road across the creek toward the Confederates. At the same time, Merritt's cavalry would press on Anderson. Wright's corps would be hit with fire as they crossed the creek, for a time some of Lee's men countering with an attack. It would be here that Stapleton Crutchfield, former artillery chief for Jackson, would be killed. The Naval Brigade of Marines and other sailors would engage in fierce hand-to-hand combat, withdrawing into trees and refusing to surrender, until persuaded to by the Union troops. Anderson in the meantime would break, Merritt's cavalry overwhelming his position. The result would be a massive amount of men captured. On the Confederate side, some 7,000 casualties, compared to a total of 1,100 Federals. Ewell and Kershaw would become prisoners, 9 generals in total being captured. Lee would exclaim, "My God, has the army dissolved?" looking at the returning survivors. This would be the last major battle fought in Virginia during the Civil War. The rebels, in the meantime, were unable to destroy High Bridge, the Federals getting to the same side of the river as them. They would set up defensively at Cumberland Church, digging in and repulsing 2 assaults. Billy Mahone acting as rearguard. Grant would begin the negotiations for surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee, though, for the time being, would tell Longstreet not yet. But Federal cavalry was still a problem. They would ride ahead of the Confederates, Sheridan making it to a place called Appomattox Courthouse. Custer's cavalry would capture rations and supplies for the army that was meant for Lee's tired and demoralized troops. A cavalry action in the meantime would see Munford's cavalry and infantry try to hold off troopers getting to the wagon train. Lee was watching and would wish to lead the troops in an assault. This is something that was also denied, much as it was at the Wilderness in Spotsylvania. Anderson, Johnson, and Pickett were all relieved of their commands, Lee giving special consideration for Pickett, questioning within earshot that man is still with the Army. It's kind of again, we've talked about this before, how Lee doesn't necessarily openly criticize somebody. That's about as much as he gets. Very biting for Lee to have said that. With Sheridan in the way, Lee held a council of war on April 8th. It was resolved to try to break out on the following day, getting through Sheridan's cavalry. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry and Gordon's infantry would break through Crook's dismounted ranks, but Ord's command would arrive to seal off the escape. With Ord in strength, along with Custer and Griffin's 5th Corps, also Humphreys pressing on Longstreet, who had dug in as a rear guard, Lee is going to see the writing on the wall. A truce would be called, William Montgomery and Lieutenant Hiram Clark becoming the last 2 casualties before the ceasefire was fully implemented. Lee and his aide, Charles Marshall, would seek the McLean House as a suitable place to meet with Grant. Grant would arrive with 12 officers for the conference, including Sheridan and O.C. Ord. Now we have a couple of accounts. The first is going to be from General Sheridan. The subject is Merritt's last cavalry charge. It was about this time that Merritt, getting impatient at the supposed treacherous firing, ordered a charge of a portion of his command. While Generals Gordon and Wilcox were engaged in conversation with me, a cloud of dust, a wild hurrah, a flashing of sabers indicated a charge, and the ejaculations of my staff officers were heard. Look, Merritt has ordered a charge. The flight of Gary's brigade followed. Lieutenant Allen was thus released. The last gun had been fired and the last charge made in the Virginia campaign. While the scenes thus related were taking place, the conversation I now speak of was occurring between General Gordon and myself. After the first salutation, General Gordon remarked, General Lee asked for a suspension of hostilities pending the negotiations which he has been having for the last day and night with General Grant. I rejoined, I have been constantly informed of the progress of the negotiations, and think it singular that, while such negotiations are going on, General Lee should have continued his march and attempted to break through my lines this morning with the view of escaping. I can entertain no terms except the condition that General Lee will surrender to General Grant on his arrival here. I have sent for him. If these terms are not accepted, and we will renew hostilities. General Gordon replied, General Lee's army is exhausted. There is no doubt of his surrender to General Grant on his arrival. General Wilcox, who I knew quite well, he having been captain of the company to which I was attached to as a cadet at the military academy, then stepped to his horse, taking hold of the saddlebags, and said in a jocular way, Here, Sheridan, take these saddlebags. They have one soiled shirt and a pair of drawers. You have burned everything else I had in the world, and I think you are entitled to these also. It's kind of funny, actually. And remember, a lot of these guys know each other personally, and there's limited things that they take away from their time at these military academies. West Point, obviously, being the biggest one, but they're going to know their tendencies of the other at least decently well, right? They're at least going to know what kind of manner of person they are, and that's going to dictate how they are going to act as a general officer when they're in the field. So here we have the arrival of General Grant. When the terms above referred to were settled, each army agreed to remain in status quo until the arrival of General Grant. We had waited some hours, and I think about 12 or 1 o'clock, General Grant arrived. General Ord, myself, and many officers were in the main road, leading through the town, at a point where Lee's army was visible. General Grant rode up, greeted me with, Sheridan, how are you? I replied, I am very well, thank you. Then he said, Where is Lee? I replied, There is his army down in that valley. He is over in that house, pointing out McLean's, waiting to surrender to you. General Grant, still without dismounting, said, Come, let us go over. He then made the same request to General Ord, and we all went to McLean's house. Those who entered with General Grant were, as nearly as I can recollect, Ord, Rollins, Seth Williams, Ingalls, Babcock, Parker, and myself and the staff officers, or those who accompany remaining outside on the porch steps in the yard. Remember, Rawlings is, of course, the aide to General Grant. We've talked about him briefly before. Babcock, also in the intelligence for the Army. We talked about him as well, especially in the Gettysburg Campaign. On entering the parlor, we found General Lee standing in company with Colonel Marshall, his aide-de-camp. The first greeting was to General Seth Williams, who had been Lee's adjutant when he was superintendent of the military academy. General Lee was then presented to General Grant, and all present were introduced. General Lee was dressed in a new gray uniform, evidently put up for on the occasion, and wore a handsome sword. He had on his face the expression of relief from a heavy burden. General Grant's uniform was soiled with mud and service, and he wore no sword. After a few words had been spoken by those who knew General Lee, all the officers retired, except perhaps one staff officer of General Grant's, and the other one with General Lee. We had not been absent from the room longer than about 5 minutes when General Babcock came to the door and said, "The surrender has taken place, and you can come in again." The formal surrender. When we re-entered, General Grant was riding on a little wooden, elliptical-shaped table, purchased by me from Mr. McLean, and presented to Mrs. Custer. The conditions of the surrender. General Lee was sitting, his hands resting on the hilt of a sword, to the left of General Grant, with his back to a small marble-topped table, on which many books were piled, while General Grant was writing friendly conversation was engaged in by General Lee and his aide with the officers present, and he took from his big breast pocket 2 dispatches which had been sent to him by me during the forenoon, notifying him that some of his cavalry in front of Crook were violating the agreement entered into by withdrawing. I had not had time to make copies when they were sent, and made a request to have them returned. He handed them to me with the remark, "I'm sorry. It is possible my cavalry at some point of the line did not fully understand the agreement." About 1 hour was occupied in drawing up the signing of the terms, which General Lee retired from the house with a cordial shake of the hand, with General Grant mounted his chunky gray horse, and, lifting his hat, passed through the gate and rode over the crest of the hill to his army. On his arrival there we heard wild cheering, which seemed to be taken up progressively by his troops, either from him or because of satisfaction with his last official act as a soldier. So a couple things to take away here. I think also you have to remember that the army is essentially being trapped here, so there is Sheridan obviously is miffed a little bit that there are some units of cavalry who break out. They're going to try to continue on to get to Lynchburg and, hopefully maybe link up with Johnson at some point. So there is a little bit of that going on. It's kind of a running fight, really, the Appomattox campaign. It's not necessarily like Petersburg where there is like a set moment where everyone stops and there's a little bit of a siege. It's all these different routes that the parts of the army are taking. You get to Appomattox and it happens pretty quickly where it's like, man, we're kind of sealed in here. We don't have enough rations to really continue on because they've all either been captured or otherwise destroyed. So there we have kind of the ending of Lee's army here. So we actually also have an account from Grant who gives us a little bit more of the proceedings inside the McLean house. What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result, and was too manly to show it. I remember Sheridan's kind of like, just kind of assumes that Lee is sort of happy to have the war come to a close. It was probably really Sheridan projecting that. Whatever his feelings, they were entirely concealed from my observation, but my own feelings, which had been quite jubilant on the receipt of his letter, were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who were opposed to us. General Lee was dressed in a full uniform, which was entirely new, and was wearing a sword of considerable value, very likely the sword which had presented to him by the state of Virginia. At all events, it was an entirely different sword from the one that would ordinarily be worn in the field. In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private, with the straps of a lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high, and of faultless form. We do have some times pointed out how these guys really take from their generals that they served with in the Mexican War. Obviously, Grant is more old, rough and ready, right? He's more of a tailor guy who's not wearing a proper uniform. And obviously, Lee is more like a Scott guy. Winfield Scott is always dressed very pristinely. He's kind of like the general, right? And so we kind of have that exemplified here as well. But this was not a matter I thought of until afterwards. We soon fell into a conversation about old Army times. He remarked that he remembered me very well in the old Army, and I told him that as a matter of course I remembered him perfectly, but from the difference in our rank and years, there being about 16 years difference in our ages. I thought it very likely that I had not attracted his attention sufficiently to be remembered by him after such a long interval. Our conversation grew so pleasant that I almost forgot the subject of our meeting. After the conversation had run on this style for some time, General Lee called my attention to the object of our meeting and said he had asked for this interview for the purpose of getting from me the terms I proposed to give his army. I said that I meant merely that his army should lay down their arms, not to take them up again, the continuance of the war, unless duly and properly exchanged. He said that he had so understood in my letter. Then we gradually fell off again into conversation about matters foreign to the subject which had brought us together. This continued for some little time, when General Lee again interrupted the course of the conversation by suggesting that the terms I proposed to give his army ought to be written out. I called to General Parker, secretary on my staff, for writing materials, and commenced writing out the following terms. Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865, General R.E. Lee, commanding Confederate States of America. In accordance with the substance of my letter to you in the 8th instant, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit, rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles, not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked in stack and turned over to the officer appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant. When I put my pen to the paper, I did not know the first word that I should make use of in writing the terms. I only knew what was in my mind, and I wished to express it clearly, so that there could be no mistaking it. As I wrote on, the thought occurred to me that the officers had their own private horses and effects which were important to them, but of no value to us. Also, that it would be unnecessary humiliation to call upon them to deliver their sidearms. No conversation, not one word passed between General Lee and myself, either about private property, sidearms, or kindred subjects. He appeared to have no objections to the terms first proposed, or if he had a point to make against them, he wished to wait until they were ready to make it. We had read over the part of the terms about sidearms, horses, and private property of the officers. He remarked, with some feeling, I thought, that this would have a happy effect upon his army. Then, after a little further conversation, General Lee remarked to me again that their army was organized a little differently from the Army of the United States, still maintaining by implication that these were two countries. That in their army, the cavalrymen and artillerists owned their own horses, and he asked if he was to understand that the men who so owned their horses would be permitted to retain them. I told him that, as the terms were written, they would not, that only the officers were permitted to take their own private property. He then, after reading over the terms a second time, remarked that it was very clear. I then said to him that I thought this would be about the last battle of the war. I sincerely hoped so, and I said further I took it that most of the men in the ranks were small farmers. The whole country had been so raided by the two armies that it was doubtful whether they would be able to put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter, without the aid of the horses that they were riding. The United States did not want them, and I would therefore instruct the officers I left behind to receive the paroles of his troops, to let every man of the Confederate army who claimed to own a horse or mule take the army to his home. Lee remarked again that this would have a very happy effect. He then sat down and wrote to the following letter. Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia, April 9th, 1865. General, I received your letter of this date containing the terms of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia as proposed to by you. As they are substantially the same as those expressed in your letter of the 8th instant, they are accepted. I will proceed to designate the proper officers to carry the stipulations into effect. R. E. Lee, General. While duplicates of the two letters were being made, the Union generals present were severally presented to General Lee. The much talk of surrendering Lee's sword and my handing it back, this and much more, that has been said to be of the purest romance. The word sword or sidearms was not mentioned by either of us until I wrote it in the terms. There was no premeditation, and it did not occur to me until the moment I wrote it down. If I happened to omit it, and General Lee had called my attention to it, I should have put it in the terms precisely, as I ceded to the provision about the soldiers retaining their horses. General Lee, after all, was completed, and before taking his leave, remarked that his army was in a very bad condition for want of food, and that they were without forage, that his men had been living for some days on parched corn exclusively, and that he would have to ask me for rations and forage. I told him certainly, and asked for how many men he wanted rations. His answer was about 25,000, and I authorized him to send his own commissary and quartermaster to Appomattox Station, 2 or 3 miles away, where he could have, out of the trains we had stopped, all the provisions he wanted. As for forage, we had ourselves depended almost entirely upon the country for that. Generals Gibbon, Griffin, and Merritt were designated by me to carry into effect the paroling of Lee's troops before they should start for their homes. General Lee, leaving Generals Longstreet, Gordon, and Pendleton for them to confer with the order to facilitate this work. Lee and I then separated, as cordially as we had met, he returning to his own lines, and all went into bivouac for the night at Appomattox. Soon after Lee's departure, I telegraphed to Washington as follows. Headquarters, Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. Secretary of War. General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. The accompanying additional correspondence will show the conditions fully. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. When news of the surrender first reached our lines, our men commenced firing a salute of 100 guns in honor of the victory. I at once sent word, however, to have it stopped. The Confederates were now our prisoners, and we did not want to exult in their downfall. So, a couple things to unpack here. Obviously, I think if you research this, if you even have heard the terms of the surrender by Grant to Lee, you would kind of understand these are pretty generous terms, right? There's always a fear in the Confederate ranks that if you were a general officer, you're going to be, put into a prison, or, something else as bad is going to happen to you if you surrender to the army if the Confederacy is no more, right? Like you're going to be tried for treason, maybe, things of that nature. Certainly, if you're a Confederate politician, that is definitely on your mind. But obviously, Grant has other ideas. I think Grant and Lee both understand when the war is over. Lee has this dream, or probably more Jefferson Davis has this dream that Lee is going to combine with Johnson. The war is going to continue. He's going to also have this dream that Johnson's going to be able to move further south. He's going to be able to continue the war, prolong the war. But Lee, and I think we can even look back to the Overland Campaign and following Cold Harbor when Grant gets across the James River and he says it's really only a matter of time. I think he kind of knew at that point it was really going to go downhill. And certainly when Lincoln is reelected, that does not bode well for the Confederacy. And sort of the writing, again, is on the wall. It's sort of a foregone conclusion here. So it's only a matter of time. That's exactly what Lee says when the James is crossed. So extremely generous terms. Grant's not really interested in making sure that the Confederates are humiliated. You would have plenty of other generals in the Union Army that would have definitely wanted that, right? There's a lot of personalities that would have, sort of behaved like a conquering Roman general even, or Republicans who are more radical, who are really going to want to twist the knife. But Grant, despite being a Republican, is more of a moderate Republican than anything else. And he kind of becomes that way earlier in life. And we'll talk about that in a future episode, actually, when we talk about Grant just as a whole. But you're going to have Grant who understands the task at hand. The task at hand is to end the war. The war is going to be over if Lee surrenders, right? There's this kind of like twist between whether the primary objective should be Richmond, should it be Lee's army. Richmond obviously is captured. Richmond probably not as important. It's probably the most important city of the Confederacy for multiple reasons other than just being the capital. But if we look back at, say, like 1862, if Richmond falls in 1862, the war's probably going to continue. It's not going to end, right? Whereas when you have the Army of Northern Virginia at this point in the war, if that gets eliminated, then yeah, the war is going to come to a conclusion. And Grant really gets that. So he's going to settle for the surrender. We don't need to go any farther than that. And we also have this kind of difference between, it's pretty well highlighted here in the account actually, it's the difference between your Confederate cavalry and artillery. They're going to need those horses. Grant's going to say, we don't need the horses, right? So he's able to concede on that point, which is going to go a long way for Lee. Lee does return to his lines, and then there's a lot of the rank and file who are going to be happy that the war's come to a close. There's this cult that surrounds the Army of Northern Virginia, surrounds General Lee. So supposedly there was this tree that he either talked to some officers or told some men that the surrender was happening, and he goes and either sits down under the tree or something, and there's like souvenir taking. He had it in Sheridan's account as well. They all understand that this is a momentous event, so Sheridan buys the table that the surrender is on. The tree gets all its branches ripped off, and people keep pieces of it for forever. So it is a peculiar event here at Appomattox as well for those reasons. So with that, the Army of Northern Virginia is no more. Grant had given Lee extremely generous terms, and the Confederates would soon be going home. Relics would be taken from the surrounding area by both sides, marking this the end of the war. But it is not the end. The Confederacy has not officially called it quits. We need to cover one of the more tragic and famous events resulting from the Civil War, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description will be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.